All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I am George Moxery. I'm a professor of law at the University of Wyoming College of Law and the director of the Firearms Research Center. We're very pleased to have with us today Dr. Chris Robbins from South Dakota State University. Chris has a PhD in health behavior. He's a Master of Public Administration, and he's an assistant professor at South Dakota State University's College of Pharmacy and Allied Health Professionals. He teaches in both the community pharmacy program and in the Department of Allied and Population Health for the Master of Public Health program. Before taking his position at South Dakota State University, he worked in the medical schools of both the University of Michigan and Indiana University in orthopedics and trauma. His primary research interest is injury prevention, focusing on both unintentional and intentional or interpersonal violence. And he's presented on his research on gun safety at both national meetings of various organizations and in peer-reviewed publications. Just to give everyone the procedure for today, Dr. Robbins will speak for 45 minutes or an hour. And then if we have time left over, he can take some questions. Questions should be put into the Q&A feature of Zoom. And then from there, when he's done, I'll read the questions to him and he'll answer them for us. So with that, Chris, take it away.
All right, thank you for that introduction. I appreciate it. First off, thank you to the leadership team of the Firearm Research Center for inviting me here. Now, this is pretty significant for me because I've been thinking about this talk for quite a while now. It's something I wanted to do because if you work within public health for a while, and like I went to APHA last year and some of the sessions there, you realize that people in public health really don't know a lot about firearms, much less than they probably should. And the same with some of the significant laws we've had over the years. They just don't have a lot of knowledge about that as well. Some do, but in general, a lot of them, I think, have some work to do in that area. So I want to do this. Really, it's set up for if you're interested in gun safety research, but really don't know a lot about it yet, sort of like an introduction. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the gun laws, but as I stated in my introduction, I'm not a lawyer, so I'm going to talk about the gun laws. It's in basically, generalities. And then I'll talk a little bit about how these laws impact gun owners, and then in turn, sort of what the effect is on public health and sort of what that interaction and that relationship is. So that's kind of like how we're going to do it. And then I've had an interest in this topic for many years, probably since I was an undergraduate. It's just a fascinating area of research. I think we're starting to get more people coming to this area of research, which is good. And I started really when I was an undergraduate for my senior thesis back in Flint, Michigan. I did basically a survey of law enforcement in the area when they were first talking about opening up the concealed carry law in Michigan. And this was about 1995. And it took really about 5 or 6 years after that they actually did do sort of a shall issue carry in Michigan. And then for my master's, again, I looked at policy analysis of the assault weapon ban. So I've always had an interest in it. So disclosures here, working on the medical side, we've always done disclosures. It's typically always been required, so it's a habit I got into. So a couple of disclosures here. I was and am currently a civilian firearms military instructor or firearms instructor. And I did have some early experience within the firearm industry when I was working my undergraduate and part of my master's degree. So I do have some familiarity with the industry and firearms in general. And then again, the disclaimer that what I'm saying here today is not a reflection of SDSU or University of Wyoming or the Firearms Research Center. And typically disclosures are here to show sort of a conflict or a bias in your research. But in this case, I consider this sort of benefit with having this knowledge in this field. It's much like some people I know that do HIV research, but actually had HIV themselves. I think they bring something extra to the research that you don't see in other cases. Here's a quick rundown of the agenda today. We're going to talk about just some quick stats about gun violence in the U.S. Then we're going to talk about some of the significant legislation we've had over time. What we call the NFA in 1934, the GCA, Gun Control Act of 68 was significant, Firearm Owners Protection Act in 1986, and what we call the 1994 assault weapons ban, we'll talk about a little bit. And then sort of some next steps within public health. And then we'll talk about what I call the other side of the coin. Because one of the fascinating things about sort of this area of research is, unlike in other areas of public health, this sort of has a pro and con side to it that you don't see. I mean, there's not a lot of good things to say about like diabetes or obesity or heart disease. But when you talk about gun safety, you sort of have these two opposing sides, which doesn't necessarily have to be the case. So hopefully that's something we can work on, that really we shouldn't be opposing. But you do have that dynamic, which does make it definitely interesting. One other area I do see coming up very similar to this is sort of this gender affirming care. You're starting to see this same sort of political push and pull. And then we'll have some questions at the end. So gun violence in the United States, you hear this a lot from public health, that we have a gun violence epidemic. I'm not sure if that exactly is true or not, or at least that phrasing. We do have a lot of gun violence in the US. That's evident. I'm not sure really if the phrase epidemic holds or not, but that could be, just semantics. But we talk about this concept of an epidemic. I think we have to really look at the numbers to break this down. Overall, as of 2022, we had 48,117 firearm-related deaths, which is a lot. And then even more injuries, about 76,000 as of 2021. So the deaths are there, but we need to kind of break them up. Because if we're not familiar really with this area of research and someone tells you there's 48,000 deaths, you may automatically think that those are 48,000 victims of criminal violence, instead of breaking it down. When we really break it down, we see really most of those are suicides. About 56% are suicides, almost 27,000. And then the other 19,500 are homicides, 472 unintentional. And you have your legal intervention. That's your self-defense shootings, whether civilian or police, and then are unknown. And one thing we can take some comfort in is just that very low number of unintentional injuries. We're doing, I think, a very good job on the public health side of keeping these injuries low. And compared to 2021, we did see a little bit increase in suicides, but homicides decreased by 6.8. So we had some positive movement in homicides, but just a little bit, sort of an unfortunate increase in suicides. And a lot of the information I'm presenting is available from Pew or Johns Hopkins. So it's readily available information. Here's just a quick graph to see it, in this figure here. You can see where the suicides are, the homicides, and then this accidental. And you can see, if we were to probably smooth this out, it'd probably actually fairly stable over time. You can see homicides. We had that sort of that rise in that late 80s, early 90s with a lot of the gang violence. And then it actually dropped down quite well. Then around 2015, we saw that rise again, and it's coming back down. So there's definitely temporal trends here. Same with suicide, but suicide was a little more stable, but still definitely way too high. But at least the good news down at the accidental shootings, you can see down here between 1980, it was pretty high, and down very, very low after 2020. So we're doing a pretty good job as far as these unintentional injuries, but suicide and homicide are still quite high. So the first significant piece of legislation we had was in 1934. Now, if you were here, if you joined us last month, the speaker there did a very good job of going through these in detail, which I'm not going to do. But if this interests you, go back and look at that one from last month, because they did a deep dive into a lot of these laws as far as what prompted them, who were the people behind it, sort of the behind the scenes look at, and then how it affected sort of the way we're going after these cases now in the system. So last month was very good. So I put in a plug for that. But we call this the NFA. It's always shortened to the NFA. You see that abbreviation. And a lot of the predominant driver of this legislation was, this Prohibition era gang violence that was happening back in the late 20s and 30s. And what this did was it created a registry of certain regulated classes of firearms. And those consisted of machine guns, what we call short-barreled rifles, short-barreled shotguns, AOWs, we'll talk about those, and then silencers. And these are typically referred to as Title II firearms. And really, it was interesting. Prior to this, legislation, you could typically buy these types of firearms or devices just over the counter. There was very little regulation. And what they did back then was basically think of it like a tax act, because they opposed a $200 tax if you wanted to purchase one of these. And that same amount is still the same today. It's still $200 if you want to purchase one of these. But back then, that was approximately $4,500. So they made it so high really just to discourage the ownership. So unless you were quite wealthy, back in the 1930s, you really weren't going to be able to afford one of those. And this act still remains in effect today. There's just a quick definition of what a machine gun is. And I put that there because you get a lot of misinformation out there on really the difference between machine guns and, semi-automatic firearms. A lot of times it gets, people confuse it. So really with a machine gun, one pull of the trigger, it keeps firing until you release the trigger. With a semi-automatic, each pull of the trigger, you get one cartridge fired. That's basically the quick and easy way to remember that. And at last count, there's about 740,000 registered machine guns in the United States. But approximately 200,000 of those, I think it's more around 170, are what we call transferable. What that means, and we'll talk about that, how that came about, but there's only certain ones that actually, as a non-law enforcement or military person, that you're allowed to purchase. Short barrel rifles, that's just basically a rifle with a barrel less than 16 inches in length. Originally it was 18 inches, but later on it was changed to 16, or an overall length less than 26 inches. As of 2021, we had over 500,000 SBRs registered in the United States. So quite a lot of those firearms are out there. Short-barreled shotguns is basically a shotgun with a barrel less than 18 inches in length, or an overall length less than 26 inches. And those aren't quite as popular, but there's still about 160,000 of those registered. And AOWs are their own sort of unique category. If they can't fit it into some other category, then they call it an AOW. And there's a list of, some common configurations for those. Difference with these is for an AOW, it's only $5 to register it. So silencers, and you may hear different terminology for silencers, could be suppressors. Old term is called a muffler, but typically silencer is the correct terminology to use. And this is really just a portable device that's designed to disguise the report of a firearm. And interestingly enough, on the public health side, you hear a lot of arguments that our gun laws should be more like those in Europe. But actually, over in Europe, in several countries, these are largely unregulated. Norway, Sweden, Slovenia, Finland, there's almost no regulations on those. You can buy them over the counter for the most part. And other European countries are listed here, perfectly legal to purchase and often less cumbersome than what we have here in the United States. And over in Europe, there is sort of this longstanding culture over there regarding silencer use while shooting. I think, in fact, maybe one country you can even be fined if you shoot without a silencer. And they're getting increasingly more popular here in the US. Right now, there's approximately 3 million in circulation right now. And it is legal to hunt with a silencer in 41 states now. There's a big push to make it legal. And that has environmental impacts as well, or simply being neighborly if you're hunting on lands near homes, using a silencer. People may not even know that you're out there hunting. So definitely less noise pollution, not to mention the impact on a person's hearing that it can have. One thing to know about these is, again, we start talking about silencers and legality. A lot of people think they're, it's like the movies, but it's not the case. Silencers really in real life do not sound like the movie. They do muffle the sound a little bit, but in some cases you still need to use hearing protection, but it's rare that you'll get one that actually sounds like the movies. That's just sound effects. This is just a quick graph here of, as of 2023, the amount of firearms that are registered just in 1 year under the National Firearms Act. But bear in mind, that could be civilian sales, police sales, military, and then all different types, all different categories as well. Now, really, if you want to purchase an NFA item, it's actually pretty simple, but it could take, used to take upwards of 6 to 12 months to get approved. You'd submit your application, your fingerprints, your $200, and then basically sit back and wait to get approved. Recently, ATF came up with their e-form system. So this is an online system now. And some people have their fingerprints, electronic now, so they can do everything right online. And recently, there's been some approvals in less than 48 hours now, compared to that 6 to 12-month wait. And I think part of that has driven a lot of the interest now, is you don't have to wait so long to get your item. So a lot of people are now doing these SBRs and silencers, and they're becoming, a lot more mainstream. Now, that first thing up there is just a quote I put in from President Biden back in 2023. And this is why it's important, if you're in public health or in this area, that you know a little bit about what you're talking about, so this doesn't happen to you. Because he made this comment here about not being able to own machine guns or not being able to own a flamethrower, which both of them are actually not true. They're like flamethrowers, they're pretty much gimmicks, but you can own them. There's no restrictions on them. But as a civilian, you can own machine guns. And I'm not really picking on President Biden, because a lot of politicians do this. It's not unique to him by any means. So let's talk about the next major piece of legislation here and how this sort of affected gun owners. This was a big one here, this Gun Control Act of 1968. And this was signed into law in October of 68. And this was after some pretty high profile shootings, like Martin Luther King Jr., Robert Kennedy in 68. But this had been brewing for a while. This iterations of this were floating around in the early 60s. It just took some events there for them to actually get this passed. It actually took a couple of times for them to actually get it passed. They had to do another reading on it really to get it passed. But the main purpose behind this legislation was, again, to reduce gun violence. What they did is they regulated sort of this interstate and foreign commerce in firearms to include importation. They created what we call prohibited persons and created what we know now as our FFL licensing system. So main outcomes of this is we have the FFL system now. If you want to sell firearms, you have to get a federal firearms license. Banned mail order of firearms. Before this, you could just order a firearm out of a catalog and get it sent to you. And it banned private interstate sales between individuals. So if I lived here in South Dakota, I couldn't buy something from someone in North Dakota. I had to buy it within that state or get it shipped to me. And then one thing it did was it created the sporting purposes test for import restrictions. And you can actually go online and actually find the form where they list all these sort of check boxes to meet the sporting purposes test. But this stopped a lot of typically small handguns from being imported, is really what it affected. So another key component this thing did was all new manufactured firearms had to have a serial number. Before that, most did, but you didn't have to have a serial number on the firearms. So this, so manufactured firearms prior to 1968 were exempted, or non-FFLs are exempt. What that would mean is if you as an individual built your own firearm, you didn't have to have a serial number on it. And this is kind of significant because this comes up in the current argument about, which you may have heard called ghost guns that don't have serial numbers. The only caveat to that is if you build your own without a serial number, but you decide to sell it, then you are required by law to put a serial number on it. That's not mentioned in a lot of the arguments that we hear. What we also had here is we had a list of prohibited persons. So it's the first time really there's a list that you fill out. When you fill out this form, you got to check that you're not a prohibited person. And then there was updates to that happened later on in 93, 94, and again in, I didn't put it in here, but again in 97 with the Lautenberg Amendment related to domestic violence. And all these, when I talk about checking the boxes, they're all on something called the 4473. So you can just type in form 4473 and that'll come up typically. And I'll see if I can pull that up. Now give me a thumbs up if you can see that. Thanks. So if you've never bought a firearm before, you hear a lot of comments on the public health side. We talk about things like states with lax gun laws versus strict gun laws or things like that. But in reality, the process of purchasing a firearm is the same, whether you live in New York or you live in Alaska. There may be certain things before or after the purchase that are different between states, but actually purchasing a firearm is the same no matter where you're at. Now, some states like Illinois, you have to get like the FOID card before you can purchase a firearm. Some states you may have to do some sort of training class or get a purchase permit. But the point you go to buy that firearm, everybody is filling out this form at the dealer. And then also afterwards, some states you may take your firearm home and that's it. Other states you may have to register it within a certain period, or in some states there's waiting periods. But typically the process is the same. You fill out this form. So really you're worried about Section B, And that's just your demographic information, your name, address. A couple new things are in here that weren't here before. That block there resided in city limits. That's new. That only came out, maybe be within this last year. Purpose of that is if they need to find you again, they can get hold of the proper law enforcement agency, whether it's a sheriff department or a local city police department. And then they have place of birth here, height, weight, birth date, social security number, that's optional. And then this unique personal identification number, oftentimes when you fill this out, you may get delayed just due to circumstances beyond your control. And if it happens a lot of times, you can get a unique number to put in there to help the process, be faster. Now, typically this process at a fast dealer, you can get this return and maybe get a decision in a couple minutes. If you get delayed, then that could, it could be anywhere from a couple hours to days, you don't know, or you could be denied. They also collect ethnicity, race information, country of citizenship. And then once you get to 21 here, this is where you're starting to answer these questions. And they're just yes or no. But if you answer them sort of wrong, then you're not going to be able to buy your firearm. And this first one is, are you the actual, transferee or buyer of this firearm? So if you click no, then right off the bat, they're going to not give you an approval because you have to be the buyer. You can't buy a firearm for somebody else. Now, there are some exceptions, such as buying it as a gift. That's usually an exception. And then a lot of these haven't changed over the years. Not having a felony, being convicted in court, being a fugitive. But the one that we're starting to see a lot of talk about is this letter F here. And this is where if you're addicted to marijuana, any depressant, stimulant, narcotic drug, or any other controlled substance. And this is the one that got Hunter Biden in trouble here, this letter F. But I think we're eventually going to see probably some action being taken on this concept of marijuana. With so many states now, at least having medically marijuana legal or recreational marijuana, we're probably gonna have to come back and relook at this. And then down at the bottom here, we have immigration status. In particular, if you're an illegal alien. Now you can actually still purchase a firearm here as a legal resident alien. There are exceptions for that. And then they have numbers down here for that for you to put in your numbers. And then from there, you sign it, and that's the last thing you do. The dealer will fill out the rest. They go and they call it in, and we'll talk about where that goes here. But if you've never seen the form before, this is what it looks like. And it can be electronic or paper-based. Now, so we talk about the GCA of 68. Sort of why does it matter? Well, really, this was the first significant piece of legislation after the NFA to regulate really the firearms industry. And it's been regulated ever since, by the ATF. It set the standards here for buying and selling throughout the country. And it set this baseline for firearms ownership with these prohibited persons. And it did set the mission for the BATF to regulate this group of products. And as I said before, it took a while for this to pass, but with a lot of the violence, some of the violence we saw in the 60s and those significant events, they did get it passed. And we had one thing to come out of this was related to individual sales. You hear this called sort of the gun show loophole. And really what that means is you can buy a firearm from an individual and not have to do, fill out the forms or that kind of thing. And that was part of the law back in 68. Next one we saw was a smaller one, but we call it the FOPA, the Firearm Owners Protection Act. And this was in May 1986, and it just went in and revised some of the elements of the GCA of 68. And one of the big drivers was there had been, since the early 80s, a lot of ATF abuses that were happening. And this came out in a 1982 Senate subcommittee report. A lot of dealers were getting a lot of harassment through the ATF, through multiple inspections, or somehow being enticed into just these technical violations. And so they did this FOPA Act to try to address some of those abuses. And what came out of that was the ATF inspections to be conducted no more than once per year, unless it's a dealer with a significant, multiple violations. One thing this also did was interstate sales of long guns were reopened. So this means you could buy, a firearm from, a different state than what you lived. This was long guns, though, not handguns. Handguns are still restricted to the state in which you live, or you'd have to have it shipped to the state in which you live. Now, some states had their own state laws that you had to be careful about. So I know when I was in Indiana, you could only buy from sort of contiguous states. So you could buy from, Ohio or Michigan, but you couldn't go a couple states over, and buy a long gun there. That eventually went away. I think a lot of that from states has gone away. I think Indiana did away with it around 2002 or 2003. So it's been a while now. One protection that came up is this issue of transportation. So you could travel through a state where possession of an item you have may be not legal there. But as long as you were traveling through the state to a destination where it again was legal, then you were all right traveling through that state. Another thing it did was prohibited the federal government from maintaining registry. They still could do the NFA registry, but they couldn't create a registry of all gun owners or all firearms. And we did expand the list of prohibited persons as well. But one thing that came out as well was that basically banned the civilian ownership of newly made machine guns. And we talked about that when we talked about the NFA. The NFA, you had to register them, but they were still made, still produced. You could buy, kind of whatever you could afford. But here, they banned civilians from owning newly manufactured ones. So all that was available were those that were already existing. And so what this did really was, almost overnight drive the prices quite high. That's why we put that term pre-86 in there. That's kind of how people talk about it is it a pre-86 or a post-86? And civilian sort of non-law enforcement and military can only own the pre-86. And there's a finite amount of those out there, and there won't be any more. So the price is extremely high, anywhere from probably 10,000 to 50,000. So prior to, 86, you could have probably bought something in 1985 for maybe $500, where now it could be worth 10,000 to 50,000. So it's definitely not something, your standard gun owner is going to get into. It's definitely sort of an arena for the wealthy anymore and collectors. And some of the arguments we hear when we talk about FOPA is with this prohibition on creation of a registry that it can hinder law enforcement and public health interventions. We did get increased prohibited persons, but also at the same time, we did protect otherwise law-abiding citizens from harassment or potential criminal charges just from trying to travel from one state to another. But it did really change the whole machine gun game, and just incredibly high costs on those now if you're a collector. So Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act of 1994, or what we called the 1994 Crime Bill. And this was signed into law in September 94, again, in response to the surging crime rates we saw in a lot of the drug wars of the 80s and early 90s. And we also had some significant high-profile events as well happen in this time period. But two key acts sort of came out of this bill, what we call the Assault Weapons Ban and the Violence Against Women Act. So the assault weapon ban existed from September 94 to September 2004. So it was for a 10-year period because that had built-in sunset. And what this attempted to do was basically ban, select styles of firearms with these militaristic features, as well as magazines with a capacity over 10 rounds. And when we talk about that particular class of firearms, they had to meet certain criteria really to be produced. And they would be banned if they had more than a certain number of criteria. So the ability to accept a detachable magazine, and two additional criteria to include a folding or telescoping stock, pistol grip, bayonet mount, flash hider. And if those terms don't mean anything to you, I'll have a picture here. You can see actually what they mean. So this is your typical sort of a copy of a military rifle like an M4. But you see towards the back, we have it's called the buttstock. You can see where your pistol grip is, magazine. That bayonet lug is just that little sort of nub under the barrel there that the back end of a bayonet would clip onto. And at the front, that slotted piece about 2 inches long there is called the flash hider. So those are the main components of what they determined, an assault weapon would be. And I just do this just because, again, terminology is important. If you're going to work sort of in the gun safety area, have a little bit of knowledge of the terminology, and go to the Firearm Research Center website, and they actually have, an excellent spot there about definitions that can really help you out as well. And this is only important because back in 2007, Representative Carolyn McCarthy was in an interview, and they were asking her about these items, and she called the buttstock the shoulder thing that goes up, something to that. So she really didn't have a good grasp of what she was talking about, and you don't want to be in that position. So you don't want to be the one that forever says something like the shoulder thing that goes up. You want to just know the correct terminology. So this is another picture taken out of a catalog of that era during the assault weapons ban. Very similar looking rifles. The only thing difference here is you see they don't have the flash hider or the bayonet lug. And then that middle one, that stock is in the fixed position. So it meets the definition of not being a banned firearm. So it doesn't have the collapsible stock, it doesn't have the bayonet leg, and it doesn't have the flash hider. So that was the essential difference that manufacturers had to do to keep producing their rifles at the time. So you hear this a lot, this term AR-15. So again, being familiar with terminology is important. AR doesn't stand for automatic rifle. It stands for Armalite, which is the company that developed it in the 50s. And 1959, Colt Company bought the rights. And then after that, first one available from Colt was in 1964. So it's not like these rifles are new. They've been around, for 60 years. Air Force first brought them in 62, and they became, our military rifle widespread in 65. But they were available since 1964. And the term AR or AR-15 really is generally common nomenclature. A lot of people just will say AR when they refer to this class of rifle. And anymore, you can get these in anything from a tiny caliber like 22 long rifle up to, a very large hunting caliber like 300 Winchester Magnum. So, and pretty much any caliber in between. You almost can't count how many calibers these rifles are available in now. Very widespread. And there's millions of them out there now. They're pretty much in common use across the country and all different activities, competitions, hunting, recreational shooting, self-defense, etc. So that's why I called the assault weapon ban the ban that wasn't. Because a lot of times when people think about the assault weapon ban, they don't know any better. They might think that, they were just totally not available back then. But they just changed the features a little bit and you could buy them and just as freely as you bought them before. And earlier ones weren't really banned. They were grandfathered in. They could be freely bought and sold. Prior to that, manufacturers ramped up production so they could make as many pre-banned ones as they could. And same way with the magazines, they were being imported by the boatload prior to the ban. There was still a lot of money. They were probably 4 times what they would have been, but there was definitely no shortage of magazines in that time as well. But prior to this little footnote here was in 1989, George H.W. banned importation of sort of foreign military pattern rifles. A lot coming from Germany or Belgium that were popular here. They were banned. You could only get what was produced in the United States, which again, as we saw with the machine guns, prices on those, they became collectible almost after that. So we talk about the assault weapons ban. This is a popular topic with public health, but really, if you get into the literature, it's inconsistent, really regarding the effect on gun violence. There's been 1 or 2 government reports at the same time that said there wasn't really a positive impact. And then even like your non-governmental, your academic publications have concluded very similar things, that the assault weapon ban necessarily didn't have a significant impact on violence. And there are some indications may have had an impact on mass shootings, though. But a lot of it, the literature is still pretty inconsistent. And this is only important because you always hear calls to renew the assault weapon ban, but we really don't have a lot of data to support that. And I would even say that sort of an indirect effect of the assault weapon ban back then was it probably drove interest in military pattern rifles, where a lot of times there wasn't interest before. And if you look at production figures, you can see just production of those type of rifles, extremely ramped up, both during the ban and especially after 2004, once that ban was lifted. The interest was already there. They were already very popular. And before the ban, you had maybe a handful of manufacturers, but during the ban and after, manufacturers sort of exploded, where you couldn't even keep track of really all the companies that were making that type of rifle. So after all that, so moving forward, what are our realistic expectations? We really haven't seen any really effective activity at the federal level. There seems to be really no appetite anymore for the assault weapons ban. And that's not going to get any better in the next 4 years. You're probably not going to see it. So we probably need to be realistic in public health, what your expectations are. And there's a lot of things public health focuses on that may be good or may not necessarily be good. You hear a lot about these extreme risk protection orders, or we call them, red flag laws. But really, when we look at that, as a violence prevention measure, there's still a dearth of information related to red flag laws. We still don't know a lot about them. A couple studies have found sort of a link to decreased suicide, but not a lot of evidence on an impact on violence. And really, whether you're pro-gun or anti-gun, nobody really wants anybody having access to a firearm that's going to hurt themselves or others. So I think there's room here within these red flag laws for consensus versus public health, own gun owners, and those in government. I think there's common ground we can find there. And a lot of it may be just in the way these laws are crafted. I think a lot of gun owners are suspicious of these laws because of things like false claims. They're afraid of that, kind of like swatting. So maybe putting in things like sort of severe penalties for false reporting, could help people become more comfortable with these, at least gun owners. And again, and maybe put in some language related to property damage. If your firearms do get taken for a bit, are you going to get them back in the same condition that you gave them up in? Some people's collections are, worth significant a lot of money. So who's going to cover that depreciation if they're damaged? And one thing we talk about these red flag laws, one sort of phenomenon happened across the country that's interesting is sort of outside of government. And you see groups of citizens working with places like gun stores now to actually have gun stores offer to store firearms for them. So law enforcement's not even involved. And this may make also, gun owners more comfortable going that route, if they know they need help or a family member needs help. I think this is something I think an area of public health could work within as well. Safe storage laws, we hear a lot about safe storage laws. Again, at the same time, gun owners don't want accidents to happen any more than anybody else. Unfortunately, gun owners have a sort of a bad track record when it comes to getting their guns stolen. Sometimes upwards of 250,000 a year have been stolen. So gun owners definitely have to do a better job keeping their firearms secure. We just don't know yet if safe storage laws are really the answer for that. And a lot of times safe storage laws aren't as black and white as, public health or a medical establishment says it is. They're, keep all guns locked up, keep your ammunition locked up separately. We've all heard that. But it can be a gray area depending on what you consider safe storage is. Say you're an older adult, you live by yourself, you don't have kids visit you, or relatives or other people probably shouldn't be, in your home. So your perception of safe storage may be that you lock your front door and that's it. So people's perception of what safe storage laws or what safe storage is could be different, depending on your experience and sometimes sort of what level you're at as a gun owner. Sometimes we have like different, like sort of tiers of gun owners. You have sort of, your hardcore gun enthusiasts are the ones on the forums. They're up on, legislative changes and they're active in the community. And that's sort of their main hobby. Then you have those that like shooting or hunting, but it's not sort of their main interest. They have other interests as well. And what I call might be your casual gun owner. This is someone that may hunt once a year or go to the range, once a year, and may have a firearm or two in the home. So their needs are different. But just like red flag laws, the literature really is inconsistent with safe storage laws as well. Down there, that link I put down there, the knowledge of state gun laws among U.S. adults was actually a very good public health article. That's good public health work there. And they looked really at knowledge of state gun laws and actually found a very low level of knowledge among gun owners about what the state laws are. So even if you pass, a lot of these laws, if the gun owners don't even know about it, is it likely to really be that effective? Universal background checks, that's one you hear a lot. We call them UBCs. And about 20 states so far have these universal background checks. And some have exceptions in there to who has to do it. A lot of times there's exemptions for transferring to family members, things like that. But again, the research is inconsistent there. And it shows some limited to moderate effects on violence or suicide, and maybe more useful in sort of urban versus rural areas. And then mandatory waiting periods. There's some evidence to suggest it may work to reduce suicides. But all of these, they're all public health is proponents pretty much of all of these. Every time you hear an interview with a public health person around gun safety, they always bring these up. I'm not sure at this point if we really have the evidence to really push these, especially at a national level. There's only just a handful of studies on these, and they may work, they may be good strategies, but as far as pushing them at this point, I think there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. And I put a couple things here called potential approaches to avoid and why. Especially if you're like a new gun safety researcher and you're looking for something to do, a couple of these always come up. Things like gun buybacks or gun lot giveaways. They're kind of what I call low-hanging fruit. They're easy to do and easy to get community support, and you can get some good metrics out of them as far as how many people showed up to your event or how many gun locks you gave away, things like that. So you can get metrics out of them. But especially for gun buybacks, you have to really be cognizant of what you hope to do with that. If it's just a place for people to dispose of unwanted firearms, you can do that. If you think it's going to make an effect, on violence, the evidence is not there. And typically the guns you're getting back are going to be pretty much older junk for the most part. And gun lot giveaways, one thing a lot of people don't know is any new firearm you buy comes with a gun lock. So a lot of times gun owners already have a box of them. And if they have a significant collection, they usually have a safe or some sort of gun cabinet anyway. They may not use them. But if it's that casual gun owner I talked about before, they might take it and hopefully use it if they just have a firearm or two just sitting in the closet, then definitely could be useful. And I showed two pictures of different types here. That cable lock is, if you're going to do a gun lock giveaway, I definitely recommend the cable lock as opposed to that other one that's basically what we call a trigger lock. Because the cable lock, pretty much the gun has to be unloaded to use it. With the trigger lock, it's very easy to put that on a firearm that's loaded if you don't know it. And if you don't get it really tightened down, movement actually could cause the trigger to be pulled. So I usually like to endorse the cable locks versus the other style. Cable locks can't work on everything, unfortunately, but it's a good compromise. And you hear about this concept of mandatory training a lot. I heard that a lot at APHA. But we start to get into sort of constitutional issues when we talk about mandatory training, just to own firearms. You see it for things like concealed permits or things like that, but just to own a firearm itself, I think you get into some issues there. So just to end here, what I call a positive note. Again, we do have a large number of gun deaths in the country, but at the same time, we are a country of 334 million people, and we have approximately 80 million gun owners in the country. And depending on what source you use, you may have 400 million firearms in circulation, just to keep it in perspective of what we have here in this country. And we have 63 million people engaged in shooting sports annually, so it's very popular here in this country. And by 2022, actually 30% of those participating were women, and which I think is great. The more people we have participating in the sport, the better. And there's even a resurgence of Black females as well coming into the sport. Hunting isn't that strong as it used to be. 2022, there's about 14.3 million. A lot of that I think has to do with just trying to find a place to hunt anymore. It's getting a lot more difficult to find places to hunt unless you know someone with property. So that's an issue that I don't know if we'll fix. And then this concept of defensive gun uses, I threw that in here because a lot of times that's forgotten, but I think that's important. And that we do have, even at a minimum, we have 55,000 over 2 million defensive gun uses, depending on your source that you use. I think even within public health, they acknowledge a number of around 62,000. Again, other sources say that's probably too low. But when you talk about this concept of DGUs, the numbers are kind of all over the place. We really don't have a good source of data to really nail that down. But even if we accept, those 62,000 at face value, that's really 62,000 people that thought having a firearm, saved them from, death or injury. So I still think that's significant. And one thing, if you're a new researcher, public health likes to work with these big data. I would say if you're starting out, step away from the big data and develop collaborations with gun owners or just the communities. And I think you can do some really good research if you develop relationships with the gun owners and the communities versus just mining big data. Any questions?
Okay, so we have about a minute, and I have two questions here. So maybe Chris, I'll run them both by you if you don't mind going over a little, and we can promise our audience that you'll give relative as quick answers as possibly as you can, if that's okay. So, first question is, uh, this is possibly outside the scope of this presentation. With the changing laws, do you see any action being taken to provide remedial measures for family/inherited members who come into possession of unregistered firearms, possibly of a specific class that requires a license, that were held in multi-generational family trusts or passed down for generations? It's my understanding that currently these firearms must be turned in and destroyed.
Now, if you had an item like say, a machine gun that was, again, like you said, passed down, but it was never registered, yeah, then you pretty much don't have a choice but to turn it in and get destroyed. There really isn't a mechanism to go back and register those. And I mean, that's been a point of contention for a while, but really isn't a way to get around that. I mean, as collectible and valuable as they are, there's not a way to get it registered. So you're kind of out of luck.
Um, I will add just very briefly that for other firearms and there are laws that recognize the difficulties faced by inheriting firearms from someone. So if you find yourself in that situation, do consult an attorney about that, because there is a possibility that you'll have recourse. But like Chris said, if it hasn't been registered, then probably you don't have much. But if it has been, you have some recourse on how you can transfer that to you and to yourself and so on. Second question and last question for the day. Hi, I'm on a PhD in constitutional law at the University of Sao Paulo. Are there any evidence-based studies that support minimum distance regulations between shooting ranges and schools? For example, here in Brazil, federal regulations require a minimum distance of 1 kilometer. Is there anything similar in the US, and what evidence supports or challenges such measures? Thank you.
I need to say that again. We do have minimum distance laws in the US, our school zones.
I think he means for shooting ranges.
Oh, for shooting ranges, I don't know of any in particular. I'm sure local zoning laws, I'm sure would cover that as far as shooting ranges.
Yeah. And are there any evidence-based studies that support minimum distance regulations
From a school,
of shooting ranges from other presumably populated areas?
I don't know of any academic studies related to that. Doesn't
Okay.
mean there isn't any.
Yeah. Okay. I will add that there are some minimum distance requirements. It depends on the state and locality, but they're certainly not, they don't exist at the national level. And with that, Chris, thank you very much for coming. I'm sure everyone is on the webinar is joining me in their applause. Thanks for coming. And I put a message into the chat if anyone is interested in being on our mailing list and finding out about more of our programming, both our webinars, our research, our working papers that we put on the website, our forum, which gets updated with various topics every few days. Please come to our website and sign up and check out our website, firearmsresearchcenter.org. Thanks, Chris. Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Thanks for the opportunity. Appreciate it.